The thugs humiliated and abused an elderly black veteran, not realizing how it would turn out for them. Subscribe so you don't miss new stories and write in the comments where you're watching this from. James Williams sat quietly behind the counter of his small corner store, the morning sun filtering through the dusty windows. The store smelled of worn wood, old books, and the faint, sweet aroma of fresh bread from a nearby bakery. Outside, the hum of the city was punctuated by the occasional sound of laughter or distant sirens. For James, it was a familiar backdrop, comforting in its constancy, though it carried undercurrents of tension that he had grown used to over the years. The store had been his for nearly 3 decades. It was small, unassuming, but a vital part of the neighborhood. Shelves were lined with essentials, canned goods, household items, and snacks for the school children who stopped by daily. A faded American flag hung near the cash register, a quiet nod to his service. For most customers, the store was just a place to grab milk or a loaf of bread, but for a few, it was a haven. A place where James listened, offered advice, and extended quiet acts of generosity. James himself was a striking figure. His tall frame had stooped slightly with age, but his presence was undeniable. His dark skin bore the marks of time and experience, his hands rough from years of labor. The sharpness in his gaze was softened only by the weight of his memories. At 90 years old, he carried himself with a dignity that belied his years, though his mind often wandered back to his youth, to the days when he was not just a shopkeeper, but a soldier. The memories came unbidden, vivid as if they had been etched into his mind. He saw himself in uniform, leading a small platoon through the cold, unforgiving terrain of Korea. He recalled the biting wind, the tension in his men's faces, and the weight of command. He had been young then, barely more than a boy, but the war had aged him in ways he hadn't understood until much later. He remembered the bond he had shared with his fellow soldiers, black and white, in a time when such camaraderie was rare. But he also remembered the sting of prejudice, the quiet dismissal of his abilities by higher-ranking officers, the looks that told him he was tolerated but not truly accepted. These thoughts swirled as he sat alone in the store, interrupted only by the soft chime of the doorbell. A young man entered, nodding politely. James offered a small smile, rising to greet him. "Mornin', Mr. Williams," the man said, setting a small package of coffee on the counter. "Mornin', Nate," James replied, his voice gravelly but warm. "How's your mother doing?" Nate hesitated, then smiled. "Better, thanks to you. She said to tell you the groceries you brought by last week were a godsend." James waved off the thanks. "Just doing what I can. You tell her she's got to take it easy, though. No sense in pushing herself too hard." Nate nodded, paid for the coffee, and left with a final, grateful glance. As the door swung shut, James leaned back against the counter, watching the street outside. His store faced a small intersection, a crossroads that had once been bustling with life. Now it was quieter, the buildings around it worn and tired. It mirrored the community, once vibrant, now struggling under the weight of neglect and systemic failures. The garden outside his store was his pride and joy. Tucked against the sidewalk, it was a splash of color in an otherwise gray landscape. He had planted it years ago, a labor of love that brought a touch of beauty to the neighborhood. Roses, marigolds, and lavender mingled with sturdy shrubs, their blooms defying the odds in a place where so much else seemed to wither. Neighbors often stopped to admire it, and James took quiet satisfaction in their praise. For him, the garden was more than decoration. It was a symbol, a reminder that even in the harshest conditions, Life could thrive with care and attention. But even the garden couldn't mask the changes happening around him. Over the past year, James had noticed an unsettling shift. The streets felt different, less safe, more unpredictable. Groups of young men lingered on corners, their voices loud and aggressive. The sounds of arguments, the occasional crash of breaking glass, and the telltale signs of drug deals had grown more frequent. James recognized the signs. He had seen them before in other places, other times. One day, as he was tending to the roses, a group of men passed by, their laughter harsh and mocking. They were young, white, and unfamiliar. One of them kicked at the edge of the garden, scattering dirt and snapping a stem. James straightened, meeting their gaze. "Careful there," he said evenly, his voice carrying a note of warning. The man smirked but said nothing, moving on with his group. James watched them go, a heavy feeling settling in his chest. He knew trouble when he saw it, and these men radiated it. He had hoped they were just passing through, but they weren't. Over the weeks that followed, they began to appear more frequently, claiming the corner as their own. James kept a wary eye on them, his instincts sharp despite his age. He didn't intervene, not yet, but he felt the tension rising. The men grew bolder, their laughter louder, their behavior more disruptive. They littered the street, blasted music, and harassed anyone who crossed their path. James watched as neighbors began to avoid the area, their heads down, their steps hurried. The store became a kind of sanctuary, a place where people could find a moment of peace. James offered quiet reassurances to those who came in, though he felt the weight of their fear. He thought of the community he had known, the vibrant, connected place it had once been, and he felt a pang of anger at what it was becoming. As the sun set one evening, James stood in the doorway of his store, gazing at the garden. The blooms were still vibrant, their colors vivid in the fading light. But the garden couldn't protect the neighborhood from what was creeping in. James clenched his fists, his mind drifting back to Korea, to the nights he had spent planning defenses, anticipating attacks. He had fought for his country once, on foreign soil, against enemies he barely understood. Now he wondered if he would have to fight again, this time for his home, for the people who looked to him for strength. The first signs of real trouble came early one morning, just as James Williams was unlocking his store. The street was unusually quiet, the kind of quiet that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. He glanced up and down the block, noticing the absence of the usual early risers. Mrs. Jenkins on her way to the bakery, young David riding his bike to the corner to deliver papers. Instead, there was an eerie stillness, broken only by the distant rumble of a car engine. As James turned the key in the lock, the sound of footsteps echoed from around the corner. A group of 5 young men appeared, their presence loud despite the silence. They laughed and shoved each other, their voices carrying an edge of arrogance that made James pause. It was the same group he'd seen before, the same smirking faces that had kicked at his garden. They approached the store slowly, deliberately, as if staking a claim. "Nice place you got here, old man," one of them called out, his voice mocking. He was tall and wiry, with a tattoo snaking up his neck. His companions chuckled, their eyes scanning the storefront and the garden with a mix of disdain and amusement. James straightened, his hand still on the door. "Mornin'," he said evenly, ignoring the taunt. "You boys need something?" The leader of the group stepped closer, his smile widening. "Yeah, we need a place to hang. Your little shop looks cozy. Mind if we come in?" James met his gaze without flinching. "Store's open to paying customers," he said firmly. Otherwise, you'll have to move along." The man's smile faltered for a moment, replaced by a flicker of annoyance. But he quickly recovered, shrugging as if to say it didn't matter. He turned to his friends, jerking his head toward the street. "Come on, fellas. Let's not waste time on Grandpa here." They moved off, their laughter echoing behind them, but James knew this wasn't the end. It was a test, a way of gauging how far they could push. And James had the sinking feeling that they weren't just passing through. Over the next few weeks, the group's presence became more pronounced. They claimed the corner near the store as their territory, lounging on the steps of a boarded-up building and leering at passers-by. Their numbers grew, and their behavior turned aggressive. They shouted at women walking by, threw trash into the street, and started selling drugs openly, their transactions quick and brazen. James watched it all from the confines of his store, his anger simmering beneath the surface. He saw how the neighborhood began to change around them, how people who once stopped to chat now hurried past with their heads down. Even regular customers became scarce, afraid to linger too long near the store. One afternoon, as James was tending to his garden, the group struck again. He was kneeling among the roses, pruning a stubborn stem, when a shadow fell across him. He looked up to see the leader of the group, flanked by two of his friends. "Nice flowers," the man said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Didn't know you were such a green thumb." James stood slowly, brushing dirt from his hands. "Takes time and care," he said. "Two things I'm guessing you don't have much of." The man's grin faltered, but he recovered quickly, kicking at the dirt near James's feet. "Well, they're taking up a lot of space. Maybe it's time to clear them out." Before James could respond, one of the others stepped forward and stomped on a rose bush, crushing its blooms underfoot. The sight sent a flash of anger through James, but he forced himself to stay calm. He fixed the man with a steady gaze, his voice low and firm. "You boys got a lot of nerve," he said. "But let me tell you something. This is my garden, my corner, and I don't take kindly to people messing with either." The leader laughed, though there was an edge of unease in it. "Relax, old man. We're just having a little fun." James didn't respond. He stood his ground, his eyes locked on the group until they finally turned and walked away. He watched them go, his jaw tight, his fists clenched at his sides. That evening, as the sun set over the neighborhood, James stood in the doorway of his store, surveying the damage. His garden was in shambles, the once vibrant flowers now trampled and broken. The sight was a punch to the gut, a painful reminder of the kind of men he was dealing with. He thought of the neighbors who had once helped him plant those flowers, of the children who used to stop and admire them on their way to school. He thought of the pride he had felt in creating something beautiful in a place that so desperately needed it. And he thought of how easily it had all been taken away. James knew he couldn't let this stand. He couldn't let these men destroy what little hope and beauty the neighborhood had left. But he also knew that confronting them head-on was a dangerous game. They were young, reckless, and armed with more than just bravado. The following day, as James reopened his store, he was greeted by a familiar face. Loretta, his next-door neighbor, stood on the sidewalk, her expression a mix of worry and exhaustion. She was a single mother, raising two young children in a world that seemed determined to make things harder for her. "Mornin', Mr. Williams," she said, her voice tight. "I wanted to talk to you about those boys." James nodded, gesturing for her to come inside. Over a cup of coffee, she told him about the group's escalating harassment. They had shouted obscenities at her as she walked her children home from school. One of them had even followed her to her building, lingering in the hallway until she locked the door. "I don't know what to do," she admitted, her hands trembling around the mug. "I can't keep living like this. My kids, they're scared to go outside." James listened quietly, his heart heavy with the weight of her words. He had seen too much of this before. Good people pushed to their limits by bad men. And he knew that if he didn't act, things would only get worse. That night, as James sat alone in his small apartment above the store, he made a decision. He had spent his life avoiding trouble, keeping his head down, and doing what he could to make a quiet difference. But this was different. This was his home, his community, and he couldn't stand by and watch it crumble. The enemy was at the gate, and James Williams was ready to defend what was his. The days that followed were heavy with tension, like the moments before a storm. James Williams kept to his usual routine, opening the store, tending to the remnants of his garden, and greeting the few customers who still braved the growing unease. But inside, his mind was working, sharp and focused, the way it had been in Korea when every decision could mean the difference between life and death. The men on the corner weren't going anywhere. If anything, their presence seemed to grow more entrenched. Their laughter was louder, their taunts sharper, their behavior more brazen. They lingered outside the store, not bothering to lower their voices as they talked about their deals, their plans, their control over the block. It wasn't just about drugs or money. It was about dominance, about reminding everyone who held the power. James had seen this kind of behavior before. He thought of the officers in Korea who dismissed him, the young soldiers who underestimated him because of his skin color. He'd learned to be patient, to watch and wait. But patience alone wouldn't solve this problem. He needed a plan. One afternoon, while sweeping the sidewalk in front of his store, James spotted old Mr. Carter hobbling down the street. Carter was a retired schoolteacher, a quiet man who had lived in the neighborhood for decades. He paused near the store, his expression wary as his eyes darted toward the group of men on the corner. "Morning, Carter," James called, leaning on his broom. Carter hesitated, then shuffled closer, keeping his voice low. "Morning, James. Place doesn't feel the same these days, does it?" "No, it doesn't," James replied, glancing toward the men. "But it's still our place." Carter nodded, but didn't look convinced. "You know, they're selling more than just trouble down there. Saw them hand off something to a kid yesterday. Couldn't have been older than 15. James felt a surge of anger, but kept his voice steady. "We've dealt with worse, Carter, and we'll deal with this." Carter gave a faint smile. "You've always been an optimist, James, but I'm not sure we've got much fight left in us." James watched as Carter continued down the street, his words lingering in the air. The truth was, Carter wasn't alone in feeling defeated. Fear had taken root in the neighborhood, and fear was the enemy's greatest weapon. That evening, James sat at his kitchen table, a cup of tea growing cold beside him. He had pulled out an old notebook, the kind he used to carry during the war. It was battered and faded, the pages filled with diagrams, notes, and strategies. He flipped through it slowly, his mind drifting back to the long nights in Korea, when he had studied maps, calculated risks, and devised plans that had saved lives. He began to sketch out the streets around his store, marking the corners, the alleyways, the choke points. He noted the habits of the men on the corner, the times they came and went, the places they lingered, the routes they used. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The next day, James began reaching out to his neighbors, starting with the few he trusted most. First was Loretta, who had been one of the few to speak openly about her fears. She hesitated when James approached her, but there was a spark of determination in her eyes that gave him hope. "What can I do?" she asked, her voice steady despite the tension in her shoulders. James smiled faintly. "For now, just watch. Keep track of what you see, what you hear. The more we know, the better we can act." Next, he spoke to young Nate, the boy who often helped his mother run errands. Nate was cautious but willing, eager to prove himself. "You really think we can do something about them, Mr. Williams?" he asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. "We don't have a choice, son," James replied. "It's them or us." As word spread, a small group began to form. Neighbors who were tired of living in fear, who wanted to take back their streets. They met in the evenings, gathering in James's store after closing time, their voices hushed but resolute. They shared stories, observations, and plans, their determination growing with each meeting. James became their de facto leader, his years of experience giving him a calm authority that the others respected. He taught them to think strategically, to focus on their strengths. "We don't need to fight them head-on," he explained. "We just need to outsmart them, make them feel like they're losing control." The first step was information. The neighbors began keeping detailed records of the group's activities. When they arrived, who they spoke to, what they did. James compiled the data, piecing together a picture of their operations. It became clear that the men weren't acting alone. They were a part of a larger network, one that supplied them with drugs and likely provided protection. Armed with this knowledge, James devised their first move. It was simple but effective: disruption. They spread rumors about police activity in the area, leaving anonymous tips that brought patrol cars to the block at random times. They tampered with the group's communication, using old tricks James had learned in the Army to intercept and redirect messages. It wasn't much, but it was enough to sow doubt and confusion. The group began to argue among themselves, their frustration growing as their deals fell through and their plans unraveled. One evening, as James was locking up the store, Loretta approached him with a look of urgency. "They're getting angry," she said quietly. "I heard them talking about taking it out on someone." James nodded, his expression grim. "We'll be ready." But readiness alone wouldn't be enough. James knew that the next steps would be riskier, that they would need to push harder if they wanted to drive the group out for good. As he stood in the fading light, gazing at the battered remains of his garden, he felt the weight of the responsibility he had taken on. This was more than a fight for his corner, his store, or even his neighborhood. It was a fight for the soul of the place he called home. And James Williams had never backed down from a fight. The growing resistance in the neighborhood felt like the first flicker of light after a long, suffocating darkness. Though small and cautious, the group James Williams had gathered was beginning to show signs of hope. For many of them, this was their first time standing up against something so tangible and threatening. The corner, once dominated by the gang, now felt less like a fortress and more like a battlefield with shifting lines. James could sense the subtle change, but he knew it was only the beginning. Loretta had become his closest ally. Her transformation from a quiet, cautious mother to an active participant in the resistance was inspiring to everyone. She kept a detailed log of the gang's comings and goings, documenting everything from the cars they drove to the faces of the young men who arrived to buy drugs. Each piece of information was like a puzzle piece James added to his growing map of the gang's operations. One evening, As the group gathered in James's store, Loretta spread her notebook on the counter. "I've been watching the deliveries," she said, her voice low but steady. "There's a pattern. They come every Tuesday night just after midnight. Same car, same driver." James leaned over, studying the notes. "You're sure it's always the same driver?" Loretta nodded. "White guy, mid-30s, always wearing a baseball cap. He doesn't stay long, drops something off and leaves." James tapped the page thoughtfully. "That's a weak link. If we disrupt the supply, we can make them vulnerable." The others murmured their agreement, their confidence growing with each small victory. Among them was Nate, the teenager who had eagerly stepped up to help. He spoke next, his voice filled with determination. "I've been watching from the alley across the street. They don't seem to notice me. I can keep track of what they're doing without being seen." James nodded approvingly. "Good work, Nate. Keep your distance, though. We don't need anyone getting hurt." Despite the progress, James knew the group couldn't win on their own. They needed more allies, people who could help tip the scales. He thought about the faces he hadn't seen at their meetings, the elderly, the overworked, the scared. They weren't absent out of indifference. They were absent out of fear. The next morning, James set out to visit those who hadn't yet joined the effort. He started with Mr. Carter, the retired teacher who lived alone in a crumbling apartment building. Carter opened the door cautiously, his eyes widening when he saw James. "James," he said, his voice tinged with surprise, "what brings you here?" James smiled faintly. "Thought I'd stop by and check in. Haven't seen you around much." Carter hesitated, then stepped aside to let James in. The apartment was sparse but tidy, a reflection of the man who lived there. Carter gestured for James to sit, then lowered himself into an armchair. "I've been keeping my head down," Carter admitted. "You know how it is. Safer that way." James nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I get it, Carter, but there's no safety in silence, not anymore. Those boys on the corner aren't going away unless we make them." Carter sighed, his shoulders slumping. "What can I do, James? I'm not like you. I'm not a fighter." "You don't have to be," James replied. "You've got a sharp mind and years of experience. You could help us figure out their patterns, find the cracks in their armor. Every little bit helps." Carter didn't respond immediately, but James could see the gears turning. After a long pause, he finally nodded. "All right, I'll do what I can." Encouraged by Carter's agreement, James continued his rounds, speaking to anyone he thought might be willing to help. He visited Mrs. Jenkins, who ran the bakery, and convinced her to let them use her back room as a safe meeting space. He talked to Marcus, the mechanic, who worked 2 blocks over, and recruited him to keep an eye on suspicious vehicles in the area. With each conversation, the resistance grew stronger. People who had once felt powerless began to find their voices, their courage bolstered by James's quiet determination. The neighborhood, which had been fragmented by fear, started to knit itself back together. But not everyone was willing to join. Some, like Mrs. Franklin, a widow in her 70s, couldn't bring themselves to take the risk. "I'm sorry, James," she said, her voice trembling. "I just can't. I've lost too much already. I can't lose my home, too." James placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "I understand, Mrs. Franklin. Just know we're fighting for all of us, including you." Even with the growing support, the gang wasn't blind to what was happening. They noticed the way people avoided them less, the way whispers seemed to follow their movements. Their frustration grew, and with it, their aggression. They started lashing out, vandalizing property, and intimidating anyone who dared to look their way. One night, James's store became their target. He arrived early the next morning to find the windows smashed and graffiti scrawled across the front. The words were crude, filled with hatred, but James didn't flinch. Instead, he rolled up his sleeves and began cleaning the mess. As he worked, neighbors began to gather. Loretta was the first to arrive, her expression grim. "They're trying to scare us," she said. "They're scared themselves," James replied. "They know we're getting stronger." By midday, the store was back to its original state, the graffiti scrubbed away and the windows patched with plywood. The neighbors who had helped stood back, admiring their work. It wasn't just a store. It was a symbol of their resilience, a sign that they wouldn't back down. That evening, the group met again, their determination renewed. James stood at the center, his voice steady and calm. "We've made progress, but this isn't over. They'll push back harder, and we need to be ready. Stick to the plan, watch each other's backs, and remember why we're doing this." As the meeting ended and the group dispersed, James remained behind, staring at the map spread across the counter. He traced the lines with his finger, his mind racing with possibilities. He knew the battle ahead would be the hardest yet, but he also knew they weren't fighting alone. For the first time in a long time, James felt something he hadn't dared to feel in years: hope. The fight was far from over, but they had allies now, people willing to stand together, to protect what was theirs. And with each step forward, the neighborhood grew closer to reclaiming its heart. The following week brought a palpable shift in the neighborhood. The quiet hum of fear that had settled over the streets for so long was beginning to lift, replaced by a sense of cautious defiance. James Williams could see it in the way neighbors lingered longer outside his store, chatting quietly, exchanging knowing glances. It wasn't outright rebellion, but it was something, a seed of resistance taking root. James, however, knew better than to underestimate the gang. Their control wasn't just about intimidation, it was a system, carefully maintained and fed by money, drugs, and fear. To dismantle it, the neighborhood needed more than courage. They needed strategy, and strategy was something James understood intimately. He spent hours at his kitchen table each night, poring over his makeshift map of the neighborhood. Every alley, every vantage point, every blind spot was marked with precision. The notes from his neighbors were scattered across the table, detailing deliveries, exchanges, and the movements of the gang members. It was a patchwork of information that, piece by piece, revealed the gang's vulnerabilities. The first step, James decided, was to disrupt their operations. If the gang started to feel their grip loosening, it might force them to make mistakes. And mistakes could be exploited. The next evening, the group gathered in the back room of Mrs. Jenkins' bakery. The smell of fresh bread filled the air, a small comfort against the tension that hung over them. James stood at the center of the group, his presence calm and steady. "We've gathered a lot of good information," he began, gesturing to the map spread out on the table. "Now it's time to act. But remember, this isn't about direct confrontation. We're not here to fight them on their terms. We're here to outthink them." He pointed to a section of the map marked with red circles. "This is where they're most vulnerable, their supply chain. If we disrupt their deliveries, we can cut off their access to drugs. Without that, they lose both their income and their leverage." Loretta nodded, her notebook open on her lap. "The delivery we talked about, the one on Tuesday nights, that's our best shot. It's consistent, predictable." James smiled faintly. Exactly. And if we're careful, we can make it look like nothing more than a coincidence. The plan was simple but effective. They would block the alley where the delivery truck usually stopped, using an old abandoned car that Marcus, the mechanic, had offered to tow into place. With the alley blocked, the truck would have to find another route, exposing it to more public areas where it would be easier for the police to notice. On the night of the operation, the group moved quietly, their actions deliberate and precise. Marcus parked the car in the alley just after sundown, its rusted frame blending into the shadows. Nate, stationed nearby with a pair of binoculars, kept watch for the delivery truck. At exactly midnight, the truck arrived. Its headlights swept the alley, pausing as the driver noticed the obstruction. For a moment, the engine idled, and James, watching from a distance, held his breath. Then, as predicted, the truck backed out and took a different route, its movements slow and hesitant. What the driver didn't know was that the group had already anticipated his new route. Loretta had placed an anonymous tip with the police earlier that day, warning them of suspicious activity near the detour. Sure enough, as the truck turned onto the main road, flashing lights appeared in the distance. The driver panicked, speeding away, but the damage was done. The police now had enough to investigate further, and the gang's supply line was temporarily severed. The next morning, the neighborhood buzzed with quiet excitement. Word of the operation spread quickly, and for the first time the gang seemed rattled. Their usual confidence was replaced with suspicion and anger. James watched from his store as they argued among themselves on the corner, their voices tense and strained. But James knew this was only a small victory. The gang wouldn't back down easily, and their retaliation would likely be swift and severe. The following night, James's prediction came true. He awoke to the sound of breaking glass, followed by the sharp crack of something heavy hitting the pavement. Rushing downstairs, he found the front window of his store shattered, shards of glass scattered across the floor. Outside, the remnants of his garden were smoldering, the once vibrant flowers reduced to ash. James stood in the doorway, his jaw clenched, his hands gripping the frame. The sight was a gut punch, a stark reminder of the stakes they were playing for. But as neighbors began to gather around him, their faces filled with concern and quiet determination, James felt his resolve harden. "We'll rebuild it," Loretta said firmly, stepping beside him. "All of it." James nodded, his voice steady despite the anger simmering beneath the surface. "Yes, we will. And we'll keep pushing until they're gone for good." The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. The group worked tirelessly to repair the damage, replacing the window and replanting the garden. Each act of restoration felt like a small victory, a way of reclaiming what the gang had tried to take from them. At the same time, James began planning their next move. The disruption of the delivery had been effective, but it wasn't enough to drive the gang out completely. They needed to strike at the heart of the operation, the gang's leadership. Through their observations, the group had identified a man named Trevor as the likely leader. Trevor was sharp and ruthless, always watching, always calculating, but he had a weakness: his reliance on a single informant who fed him information about the neighborhood. James devised a plan to cut off this line of communication. It would require careful coordination and a degree of risk, but if successful, it could cripple Trevor's ability to maintain control. As the group gathered for another meeting, James laid out the details. "We're going to intercept the informant," he explained. "Find out what he knows, and use it to turn the tables on Trevor." The room buzzed with a mix of excitement and apprehension. The stakes were higher now and the danger was more immediate. But as James looked around at the faces of his neighbors, he saw not fear, but determination. They were ready. And so was he. The battle for the neighborhood was far from over, but with each step forward, James felt the balance shifting. The gang was no longer an unstoppable force. They were vulnerable, and the community was ready to seize that vulnerability. The war wasn't won yet, but the resistance was growing stronger. And James Williams, the soldier who had once fought on foreign soil, was leading the charge on his own streets, determined to protect the home he had spent a lifetime building. The neighborhood had reached a boiling point. The gang, frustrated and on edge, grew more aggressive with each passing day. Their usual posturing had turned into outright threats, their voices carrying an edge of desperation. James Williams could feel the tension in the air, a heavy pressure that weighed on everyone. The resistance had made its mark, but the gang wasn't retreating. If anything, they were digging in, determined to reassert their dominance. James had anticipated this escalation. Every step they'd taken so far, the disruptions, the sabotage, the quiet defiance had been building towards this moment. He knew that to win, they would have to take a calculated risk. The gang's leader, Trevor, was the key. Remove him, and the entire operation would crumble. The plan to intercept Trevor's informant had worked. The man, a nervous, jittery figure named Colin, had been caught off guard when Loretta confronted him. Armed with weeks of surveillance, she had enough evidence to corner him without violence. Colin, terrified of both the gang and the growing resistance, spilled everything he knew. "They're meeting tomorrow night," Colin had stammered, his voice shaken, "at the old warehouse on 12th Street. Trevor's bringing everyone. It's a big deal, something about new supplies, new deals. The information was a gift, but it came with risks." The warehouse was deep in gang territory, far from the relative safety of the neighborhood. To confront them there would be dangerous, but it was also their best chance to strike a decisive blow. That evening, James called an emergency meeting. The group gathered in the back room of Mrs. Jenkins' bakery, their faces tense but resolute. James stood at the center, his voice calm and steady despite the gravity of the situation. "This is it," he began, pointing to the map spread out before them. "Tomorrow night, Trevor's holding a meeting at the warehouse. It's their stronghold, but it's also their weakness. If we can disrupt this, we can take them down for good." Loretta frowned, her arms crossed. "What do you mean by disrupt? We can't just walk in there." James nodded. "No, we can't. But we don't need to. Our goal isn't to fight them head on. It's to expose them, to make it impossible for them to operate here." He outlined the plan. They would use the meeting to create chaos. Colin, now cooperating fully, would feed Trevor false information about a supposed betrayal within his ranks. Meanwhile, James and a small group would set up outside the warehouse, gathering evidence of the gang's activities. Once the chaos inside reached its peak, Loretta would contact the police with an anonymous tip, ensuring they arrived at just the right moment. The room was silent as the group absorbed the details. Finally, Marcus, the mechanic, spoke. "It's risky," he said, "but it could work." "It has to," James replied. "This is our chance to end this once and for all." The next day passed in a blur of preparation. Marcus worked on securing recording equipment, while Loretta rehearsed her call to the police, making sure every detail was precise. James spent hours reviewing the map, going over every possible outcome, every contingency. He knew the risks, they all did, but there was no turning back. As night fell, the group gathered at the edge of the neighborhood, their expressions a mix of determination and fear. James looked at each of them, his voice firm but encouraging. "We've come this far because we've stood together. No matter what happens tonight, remember this: we're fighting for our home, for each other." The group nodded, their resolve unwavering. Then, under the cover of darkness, they moved toward the warehouse. The area around the warehouse was eerily quiet, the streets empty save for a few dimly lit street lamps. James and Marcus took up positions near a cluster of abandoned cars, their eyes fixed on the building's entrance. From their vantage point, they could see men coming and going, their movements sharp and deliberate. Inside, the sound of raised voices echoed faintly, a sign that Trevor's meeting was already underway. James pressed the small earpiece in his ear, signaling Loretta. "We're in position," he whispered. "Everything ready on your end?" "Ready," came her reply, her voice steady despite the tension. Inside the warehouse, Colin was playing his part. His voice, trembling but convincing, carried through the cavernous space as he fed Trevor the false information James had prepared. "I heard them talking, Trevor," he said, his words hurried. "They're planning to take you down, split the operation." Trevor's response was sharp and angry, his voice cutting through the air. "Who? Who's behind this?" Colin hesitated, then named one of Trevor's closest lieutenants, a man known for his short temper. The room erupted in accusations and shouting, the carefully constructed alliances within the gang beginning to fracture. Outside, James and Marcus recorded everything. The shouting, the threats, the sound of a gun being drawn, it was all captured, undeniable proof of the gang's activities. As the chaos inside reached its peak, James gave the signal. "Now," he said into the earpiece. Loretta made the call, her voice calm and clear as she described the scene to the police. "There's a gang meeting at the warehouse on 12th Street, she said. "They're armed, and it's getting violent. You need to hurry." Minutes later, the sound of sirens filled the air. The gang members inside the warehouse scrambled, their earlier bravado replaced by panic. Some ran, others tried to hide, but there was nowhere to go. The police surrounded the building, their presence overwhelming. James and Marcus watched from their hiding spot as the officers moved in, their actions swift and coordinated. Within moments, Trevor and his men were in handcuffs, their operation dismantled in a single, decisive blow. As the last of the gang members were taken away, James allowed himself a rare moment of relief. The neighborhood wasn't free yet, not completely, but this was a victory, one they had fought hard to achieve. The group reconvened at the bakery, their faces weary but triumphant. Loretta hugged James tightly, her voice filled with emotion. "We did it," she said. "We really did it." James smiled, his shoulders relaxing for the first time in weeks. "We did, but the work's not over. We've taken back our streets. Now we have to keep them." The others nodded, their determination renewed. The fight had been long and difficult, but together they had proven that even the darkest corners could be reclaimed. And for the first time in years, the neighborhood felt like home again. The air was different in the neighborhood the morning after the raid. For the first time in months, there was no shouting from the corner, no tension lingering in the streets. The gang was gone, swept up in the police operation, their stronghold dismantled. The once oppressive atmosphere had lifted, replaced by a cautious optimism that seemed to ripple through the community. James Williams stood outside his store, leaning on his broom as he watched the early risers go about their day. Mrs. Jenkins from the bakery waved cheerfully as she passed, and Nate pedaled by on his bike, flashing a grin that was free of the worry that had clouded his face for so long. It wasn't perfect. There was still fear, still hesitation, but the change was undeniable. For James, however, the victory felt bittersweet. The shattered windows of his store and the charred remains of his garden were stark reminders of what the neighborhood had endured. As he swept the broken glass into a dustpan, he felt the familiar ache in his joints, the weight of years spent fighting battles he hadn't asked for. But this wasn't a moment for self-pity. The fight may have been over, but the work of rebuilding had just begun. The first to arrive was Loretta, carrying a tray of coffee and a determined look. "Thought you could use a pick-me-up," she said, setting the tray on the counter. James smiled, accepting the cup she offered. "Thanks, Loretta. You didn't have to." "Yes, I did," she replied firmly. "After everything you've done for this place, it's the least I can do." She wasn't alone for long. One by one, neighbors began to appear, armed with tools, paint, and flowers. Marcus brought sheets of plywood to cover the broken windows, and Mrs. Franklin arrived with pots of begonias to replace the destroyed plants. Even old Mr. Carter hobbled up with a trowel in hand, his usual cautious demeanor replaced by quiet determination. "We figured it was time to give this place a little love," Loretta said, watching as the others got to work. "You've done enough carrying this neighborhood, James. Now it's our turn." James didn't argue. Instead, he joined them, his hands steady as he helped replant the garden he had nurtured for so many years. The work was slow and deliberate, each flower carefully placed, each piece of broken glass meticulously swept away. It wasn't just about fixing what was broken. It was about reclaiming the space, turning it into something stronger, more resilient. By midday, the garden was beginning to take shape. Rows of marigolds and daisies lined the sidewalk, their bright colors a sharp contrast to the gray of the surrounding buildings. A few neighbors hung handmade signs in their windows, messages of hope and solidarity that reminded everyone of what they had fought for. As the sun reached its peak, the group took a break, gathering on the sidewalk with sandwiches and lemonade provided by Mrs. Jenkins. The atmosphere was light, filled with laughter and stories, a stark contrast to the tension that had defined the neighborhood for so long. Nate, sitting cross-legged on the curb, looked up at James. "Do you think they'll come back?" he asked, his voice quiet. James considered the question carefully before answering. "Maybe," he said honestly. "But if they do, we'll be ready. This is our home, and we're not going to let anyone take it from us again." The boy nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It's different now. Feels like people actually care." "They do," James said. "Sometimes it just takes a push to remind people what they're capable of." The day ended with a small celebration. Someone brought out a radio, and music filled the air as neighbors mingled and admired their work. The garden, though still a work in progress, stood as a symbol of everything they had achieved. It wasn't just a patch of flowers, it was a testament to their resilience, their refusal to give up even when the odds seemed insurmountable. As dusk fell, James stood at the edge of the garden, his hands resting on his cane. Loretta joined him, her arms crossed as she surveyed the scene. "You know," she said, "this garden of yours has always been more than just flowers. It's hope. For all of us." James nodded, his gaze steady. "That's why I started it. Back when things were tough, I needed a reminder that even in the worst conditions, something good could grow. And now it's grown into something bigger than you," Loretta said with a smile. "It's ours now." The words brought a rare warmth to James's chest. For years, he had carried the weight of the neighborhood on his shoulders, convinced that he had to fight alone. But tonight, as he looked at the faces around him, he realized that wasn't true. They were a community, stronger together than apart, bound by a shared determination to protect what they loved. The night ended quietly. As the neighbors dispersed, James locked up the store and climbed the stairs to his apartment. He sat by the window, looking out at the garden below. The flowers, illuminated by the glow of a nearby street lamp, seemed to shimmer in the darkness, their colors vibrant and defiant. For the first time in a long time, James felt at peace. The battle was over, but the legacy of what they had built would endure. The garden, the store, the neighborhood, it was all a reminder that even in the face of adversity, hope could thrive. And James, the soldier who had fought for his country on distant shores, had found his greatest victory here, at the corner he called home. The days that followed felt like a new beginning for the neighborhood. The gang's absence created a space that the community was quick to fill with life. Slowly but surely, the streets began to transform. Children played on the sidewalks again, their laughter ringing out like a melody long forgotten. Neighbors who had once kept their heads down now lingered on their porches, sharing conversations and smiles. It wasn't just a return to normalcy. It was the start of something better. James Williams watched these changes with quiet satisfaction. From his vantage point at the store counter, he saw the resilience of the people he had lived among for decades. They were no longer merely surviving. They were thriving, reclaiming what had always been theirs. His garden, once a casualty of the gang's aggression, was now the centerpiece of this transformation. The neighbors had taken to calling it the Garden of Renewal, a name that made James smile despite his usual reluctance for attention. The flowers had returned in full force, vibrant and colorful, a testament to the community's determination. One morning, as James knelt among the roses, carefully trimming the stems, he heard a familiar voice. "Mr. Williams." James turned to see Nate bounding up the sidewalk, a wide grin on his face. The boy skidded to a stop next to the garden, nearly tripping over the edge of the flower bed. "Easy there, son," James said with a chuckle. "These flowers didn't survive all that just to be trampled by you." Nate flushed but grinned sheepishly. "Sorry, sir. I just wanted to show you something." He pulled a crumpled flyer from his pocket and held it out. "We're starting a youth group for the kids in the neighborhood. Thought maybe we could help keep things looking nice, like the garden." James took the flyer and scanned it. It was simple but heartfelt, with hand-drawn illustrations and a clear message. A call for young people to come together to build something positive in their community. The sight warmed James's heart. "That's a fine idea, Nate," he said. "You've got a good head on your shoulders." Nate beamed. "Thanks, Mr. Williams, and I was hoping maybe you'd come talk to us sometime. Tell us about what you did, how you helped stop those guys." James hesitated. He wasn't one for speeches or the spotlight, but as he looked at Nate's eager face, he realized that this was about more than just him. It was about passing on what he had learned, ensuring that the next generation understood the power of standing together. "I'll think about it," he said finally, his voice gruff but kind. "Now, go on. Looks like you've got a lot of work to do." As Nate dashed off, James returned to his pruning, his thoughts lingering on the boy's words. The youth group was just one of many new initiatives springing up in the neighborhood. Loretta had started a community watch program, organizing regular patrols to ensure the streets stayed safe. Marcus had begun offering free car repairs for single parents and seniors, his garage becoming a hub of goodwill. Even Mrs. Franklin, who had been too frightened to join the resistance, now baked pies for fundraisers to support the neighborhood's renewal efforts. One evening, as the sun dipped low on the horizon, the community gathered for a celebration. Tables were set up along the street, laden with food prepared by the neighbors. Music played from a speaker someone had brought, filling the air with a lively rhythm. Children darted between the tables, their laughter blending with the hum of conversation. James sat at the head of the longest table, a plate of barbecue in front of him, and Loretta seated to his right. She nudged him with her elbow, a sly smile on her face. "You know this is all because of you, right?" she said. James shook his head. "It's because of all of us. I might have started it, but it's the people who finished it." "Modest as always," Loretta replied, rolling her eyes. "But don't think we're letting you off the hook. The kids are still waiting for that talk." James grunted, pretending to be annoyed, but he couldn't hide the small smile that tugged at his lips. The idea of speaking to the youth group made him nervous, but it also filled him with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. When the celebration wound down and the neighbors began to disperse, James found himself alone in his garden. The flowers swayed gently in the evening breeze, their colors muted but still vibrant in the fading light. He sat on the edge of the flower bed, his hands resting on his knees, and let out a deep breath. For the first time in what felt like forever, the streets were quiet. Not the oppressive silence of fear, but the peaceful stillness of a community at rest. James closed his eyes and let the moment wash over him, a rare sense of contentment settling in his chest. The next morning, James awoke with a renewed sense of energy. He spent the day preparing for his talk with the youth group, jotting down notes and thinking about the lessons he wanted to share. When the time came, he walked to the community center where the group was meeting, his steps steady despite his nerves. The room was filled with young faces, their eyes wide with curiosity. Nate stood at the front, introducing James with the enthusiasm of someone who had found a new hero. As James took the floor, the room fell silent, every gaze fixed on him. He spoke simply, recounting the story of the neighborhood struggle and the lessons he had learned along the way. He talked about courage, unity, and the importance of standing up for what was right. But most of all, he emphasized the power of hope. "When you plant a garden," he said, gesturing to the flowers they all knew so well, "you don't see the results right away. It takes time, care, and patience. But if you nurture it, even in the hardest conditions, it'll grow. That's what this neighborhood is, a garden, and it's up to all of you to keep it blooming." When he finished, the room erupted in applause. James, unused to such attention, nodded his thanks and retreated to the back of the room. But as he watched the young people gather to discuss their plans, he felt a quiet pride. The future was in good hands. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood continued to flourish. The garden grew, the streets became safer, and the sense of community deepened. James, once a solitary figure tending his flowers, found himself surrounded by people who had become like family. Together, they had reclaimed their home, proving that even in the face of adversity, hope could take root and thrive. And in the heart of it all, the garden stood as a living testament to their resilience, a symbol of renewal that would endure for generations to come. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to stay updated with more powerful stories like this one. If you enjoyed the video, share it with friends. Your support helps spread the message. And explore our channel for more stories that inspire, challenge, and connect. See you in the next one.